It is the 14th of November, and this day in Baptist history, our reading is one small man, but a giant for God. Our verse of scripture comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1. Now I, Paul, myself beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you. This is a great day in the history of Baptists in the Southland, though it has never been observed as such. It was on November 14, 1855, that a small group of Baptists invaded the South with the gospel. Until that time, little progress had been made by the regular Baptists in the South, but Reverend Shubal Stearns, assisted by his brother-in-law Daniel Marshall and Joseph Breed, were used of God to change the spiritual temperature in that complete territory. The little group of Baptists totaled 16 when they arrived at Sandy Creek, North Carolina, but in a year's time they had 606 members. But more important is the fact that the Sandy Creek Baptist Church in 17 years became the mother church to 42 churches and produced 125 preachers. Shubal Stearns was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 28, 1706. His religious background was Presbyterian. In 1740, the Great Awakening was experienced through the preaching of George Whitefield. Many of the converts of that great spiritual movement were known as New Lights or Separatists. In 1745, Stearns associated himself with this body of Christians. Though his education was limited, he was impressed with the call to preach. To his credit, Stearns gave himself to reading extensively. Becoming convinced of believers' immersion, he left the Pedo Baptists in 1751. On May 20th, 1751, Stearns was baptized by Reverend Waite Palmer, a Baptist pastor in Toland, Connecticut. Several months later, he was ordained into the Baptist ministry, and he began to travel and preach, moving to Opicon Creek in Berkeley County, Virginia in 1754. He was joined by his brother-in-law, Daniel Marshall, and the two continued preaching in the area. Reverend Stearns was not satisfied with the results, and when he received a letter from a friend of former days on June 13, 1755, inviting him to North Carolina, he felt impressed of the Lord to accept the challenge. We have only brief verbal descriptions of this man of God, but let me share them. Morgan Edwards, who traveled extensively among the Baptists to obtain materials for a history, wrote thus, and I quote, "Mr. Stearns was but a little man, but a man of good natural parts and sound judgment. Of learning he had but a small share, yet was pretty well acquainted with books. His voice was musical and strong, which he managed in such a manner as, one while, to make soft impressions on the heart, and fetch tears from the eyes in a mechanical way, and anon to shake the very nerves and throw the animal system into tumults and anxiety." End of quote. Tyndus Lane, who ultimately became a leader among the Baptists of Tennessee, wrote of his observation of Reverend Stearns before his own salvation, and I quote, "When the fame of Mr. Stearns' preaching had reached the Yadkin, where I lived, I felt a curiosity to go and hear him. Upon my arrival, I saw a venerable old man sitting under a peach tree, with a book in his hand, and the people gathering about him. He fixed his eyes upon me immediately, which made me feel in such a manner as I never had felt before. I turned to quit the place, but could not proceed far. I walked about, sometimes catching his eyes as I walked. My uneasiness increased and became intolerable. I went up to him, thinking that a salutation and shaking hands would relieve me, but it happened otherwise. I began to think that he had an evil eye, and ought to be shunned. But shunning him I could no more effect than a bird can shun the rattlesnake when it fixes its eyes upon it. When he began to preach, my confusion increased so that nature could no longer support them, and I sunk to the ground." End of quote. In 1758, Reverend Stearns visited the 9 Baptist churches that had already been established, and he invited each church to send messengers to form an association of churches. Thus the Sandy Creek Association came into being for preaching, singing, and the conversation as to what God was doing throughout the region. Hearts were stirred, and God's people went forth to spread the gospel. Unlike with so many modern-day associational meetings, at these services, revival fires often fell as the saints sought the Lord. After 12 years of these meetings, to better accommodate the churches who were coming from greater and greater distances, the association was divided into 3 associations, which represented churches in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. Acknowledgments have been late in coming, but of recent date it has been said, and I quote, "It is not too much to say that the separate Baptists are historically and hereditarily the chief component of Baptist life in the South, both white and Negro," end of quote. Another has written, and I quote, "A preacher of unusual power, Stearns was small in stature but forceful in personality. A prime influence in their, that is, the separate Baptists, rapid spread. He helped to stamp them firmly with both a modified Calvinistic doctrine and an evangelistic zeal," end of quote. We thank God for the memory of such men of God as Shubal Stearns, the visionary Baptist leader of the South. To God be the glory.